Michael Secilia, he was born and bred in Pittsburgh. He's a professor of history and the social sciences, and his research includes Croatia and Croatian American history. Seems like the reason we brought you here today. He volunteers here with us for the Society as a docent, so he gives some of those tours. Maybe you've been on his tours. And he appreciates every opportunity to share and discuss the marvel of this sacred space.
Welcome to class. On a Sunday, a beautiful Sunday. I know there are probably a million other places where you guys could be right now. But I do appreciate you coming to hear me talk a little bit about some of my passions and some of my interests. And you may or may not know, right? So like when your ancestors came to the United States, when did they come? It's probable that they came between the 1880s and the First World War. Does that sound pretty right, pretty correct for most of you? Right. So again, the bulk of Croatian immigration to the United States occurs over a relatively small span of time. It's only about 35 years, only about 35 years. And there are a few 100,000 Croatians who will come to the United States. Pittsburgh will become the main destination for the Croatian people, or for the ethnic Croatian immigrants. So we're going to talk all about that. Share some stories, the hardships about what Croatians faced here in the United States at the turn of the century, some of their causes for immigration, but also too, if you're not of Croatian ancestry or descent, but if you do have ancestors who maybe came to the United States in relatively the same time period, it's likely that they experienced or went through very, very similar experiences. So in a way too, this is a broader conversation about immigration at the turn of the century. Does that make sense? Great. All right. So again, if you do have ancestors though who came from what today we would call Croatia. Croatia, however, is a pretty young country, right? Does anybody know when was Croatia founded? The modern nation state of Croatia? Yeah? 1992, formally? Yeah, so 1992. But again, if you're of Croatian descent, your ancestors probably came between the 1880s and the First World War. And they were coming from this massive empire in Central Europe, known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the dual monarchy, which was established originally in 1867. Really, it was the Austrian response to Prussian ambitions and to the unification of Germany. There are a lot of changes occurring in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. The formation of nation states is one of them as well. Germany will soon be formed or unified in 1871. But again, Austria before that had been sort of the traditional powerhouse of Central Europe. And this is their reaction to Prussian ambitions and to this unification of Germany. The Habsburgs, by the way, they're this very important, historic royal family in Central Europe. Austrian, they're ethnically German. And again, Croatia had been part of the Habsburg realm or the Habsburg Empire since 1527. So a very, very long time. Okay. And in 1867, once Austria-Hungary is formed, it comes with, or the reorganization, let's say, of the Habsburg Empire, it comes with a basic Bill of Rights. A basic Bill of Rights, the Staatsgrundgesetz. Within that basic Bill of Rights is the right to emigrate, the right to leave, an individual right to emigrate. There is one major exception that we'll talk about in just a minute, but historians really look back to this period as a golden age of movement, and a free movement, mind you. So again, on one hand, there's a recognition that people have a right to leave the United States. On the other side of that coin, we still have what is basically an open door policy as well. So again, it is this period of great demographic shift across the West, redistribution of populations, and once more the Croatians will take part in these mass migrations, most of them coming to the United States. And jus emigrandi, by the way, this is the principle of a right to emigrate, once more recognized by the Austro-Hungarian Constitution, but it is subject to limitation. And the major limitation is conscription, universal conscription. So in other words, if you're a military-aged male in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you are not supposed to leave until you've lived up to your duties, okay? Perhaps paradoxically, or maybe a bit of a contradiction, but that will inevitably be actually one of the secondary reasons for why many of the young men choose to emigrate, right? So again, this law that of universal conscription in the old empire will spur additional immigration of young men. Why? Because they don't want to serve in the Austro-Hungarian forces. Does that make sense? In addition to that, I mean, pacifism as well. The Croatian people, the Croatian men, they're overrepresented in the Austro-Hungarian army, in the Austro-Hungarian military. Part of this is geographical. Could you find Croatia on a map, by the way? I hope so. On this map, so this is a larger image of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Croatia today is basically this hook shape at the bottom, that aqua green color there. But notice the shape. Why is Croatia shaped that way? Can you imagine? Right. So again, this is the frontier of the empire, and what was the Ottoman Empire and other enemies sort of pushing in, right? Pushing into these traditional Austrian lands and into parts of Europe is what again creates the shape of Croatia today. So I hope that makes sense. And the military frontier, Again, this is the southern frontier of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, established originally in 1553. It will be abolished in 1873, but nonetheless, this is a complex system of fortified towns to resist the frequent Ottoman raids into Europe. But so who were your ancestors that came from Croatia? They came predominantly from the peasantry, from the peasant class. In fact, most of the immigrants from Central Europe at the turn of the century were from the peasant class. I don't mean peasant in a pejorative way. I mean they were agricultural laborers. That's what they were. Across Austria-Hungary, about 60 to 70% of all Austro-Hungarian subjects were peasants. They were peasants. About 84% of the Croatian people are peasants. So again, an overrepresentation of the peasantry within what is today Croatia. The Slavic peoples that would have included the Croatians, but also Slovaks, Serbs, Slovenians, all these different groups of Austria-Hungary, they are the largest demographic within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There are no less than 6 major Slavic languages spoken in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, they're all considered peasant tongues. And the Slavic peoples, they don't have a lot of cultural prestige or social prestige. There are certain benefits associated with being German and speaking German. So again, if you're not an ethnic German, even though the Slavic peoples, once again, are the majority of the Austro-Hungarian population, it comes with certain disadvantages. The Croatian peasants, nonetheless, right, they are highly skilled and expert farmers. Highly skilled, expert farmers. Again, agriculture is labor intensive. The agriculture that the Croatian people, that your ancestors were engaged with, was labor intensive, but it's also knowledge intensive. And these were skills that would have been passed down over generations. Families lived essentially in the same regions for very, very long periods of time. And consider, once your ancestors, many of your ancestors begin coming to the United States, they're categorized as what? What do they tend to be categorized as? Unskilled labor, right? Which even that word alone, right, comes with maybe some certain connotations. It is true that the Croatian people, many immigrants coming from Austria-Hungary, that they had no industrial experience, or if they did, maybe very little industrial experience. But this word unskilled, this perception of the unskilled immigrant lends into other common perceptions at the turn of the century, that the immigrants were ignorant, backward, dangerous. A big one was incompatible with American democracy. That's especially true of or what was believed of Catholic immigrants at the turn of the century. Okay, and again, the majority of the Croatian people, they are deeply Catholic, Roman Catholic. Okay, so those were certainly allegations that would have been leveled against the Croatian people. By the way, the Croatian people are coming largely for economic reasons, not for religious freedom. Ironically, the religious discrimination that they face will be here in the United States. And just, I don't know if you can see, I hope you can, but a nice painting by a Croatian artist in 1879, Nikola Mesic, picking pumpkins. It's a little better image. And by the way, it's kind of a nice touch. There's a little dog sticking his head out of the pumpkin patch. Right. And the form of agriculture that your ancestors, or that our ancestors practiced, was subsistence agriculture before the turn of the century. The production of food for direct consumption. So not necessarily for markets, not for commercial sale. There is some money in the Croatian lands, mostly in the cities and urban centers. The Croatian peasants would occasionally go to the market towns to sell their produce and their wares to make a little bit of cash. But cash is rare. It is generally rare among the Croatian peasantry. Instead, again, what they're growing, the majority of it is for their own consumption, to barter with. And again, I mentioned they are expert farmers. They're growing all kinds of things: maize, wheat, oats, rye, barley, flax, fruits like apples, plums, cherries, different nuts, grapes for winemaking, pumpkins, potatoes, cattle, also lots of livestock, cattle, horses, pigs, goats, poultry. And the British Foreign Office in 1920, by the way, they're examining the people, the conditions in Croatia, and one of the officials from the British Foreign Office reports the wants of the people are very few, and in the country districts, most of the daily necessities of life are supplied by the peasants themselves. The core of traditional Croatian peasant society is the zadruga, or was the zadruga. It was a South Slavic commune, basically. It's a socio-economic necessity for semi-feudal conditions, characterized by joint families, extended families who live together, structured around a patrilineal kin core. It's a fancy way or an academic way of saying it was a patrilineal society sort of structured around a patriarch or a father figure. Okay? The peasants, they till the land in common. Land holdings are not individually owned or divided into individual plots. This will begin to change at the turn of the century. This is one of the reasons, a primary motivator for immigration to the United States. The Croatian people in many ways begin losing their land, the land that they had been working for generations. And again, the house father, really the core figure of the Zadruga, the senior patriarch, the administrator, let's say, of the group, sort of the headmaster of the farm. All of the sons of the patriarch are expected to remain in the Zadruga. Their wives expected to marry into the Zadruga. What's the alternative, though, if you're a daughter? Right? You marry out of the Zadruga. But marriage, it's generally arranged. It's exogamous. It's also patrilocal. In other words, right, the brides move to the husband's Zadruga, or to the husband's farm. The women are inducted then into this new family, in a way. The newcomers, the new women, would be sort of at the lowest rank, though. Does that make sense? And over time, the women may sort of have their own sphere of influence, and the older matriarchs, the older women, would have a sphere of influence of their own. But again, this is a cooperative or an economic cooperative, an agricultural cooperative. The labor, this cooperative labor ensures economic viability. It provides a welfare system for the old as well as the young. And it's associated with values of family, values of community, values of reciprocity, also of non-monetary wealth. Again, if you've been here before and you've seen these wonderful murals, some of those themes you may recall are very, very prevalent here on the walls of St. Nicholas Church. In hindsight, the Zadruga is very often romanticized as this idyllic utopian society. On the other hand, the Zadruga is often also disparaged as backward, as anti-modern. Okay, those are kind of like the two ends of the spectrum. But I hope this makes sense. By the way, this image that you see here, if you are close enough to see it, this is the traditional house, the Zadruga home. A very large house, what some of the Germans refer to as the barn house. Kind of looks like a barn, right? There would be a large room in the bottom floor. But anyway, this photograph was taken during an expedition in the 1920s, of which the artist responsible for these murals, Vanka, was part of, a member of. So, and again, just painting from 1902, a representation of the women working in the fields, of cutting grain, and you have the male patriarch behind them. The patriarch, again, tended to be a senior man, maybe incapable of doing physical labor himself at that point, but nonetheless, kind of the overseer, the manager of the farm. Does that make sense? Yep, great. All right. And again, the Croatian peasant people, they were a communal people. And we see that represented through their arts. They're also very musical people. And the national dance, the Croatian national dance, the kolo, or the wheel. It's a South Slavic circle dance. The ethnic Croats, or the Croatians, were by no means the only South Slavic group to dance the kolo. It's a dance associated more broadly with the South Slavs. But this dance, think of it, right? Even the word wheel, or this symbol of a circle, right? This embodiment of community, of togetherness. Also, traditionally, this is a dance where young men might be first introduced to their prospective wives, and vice versa. Again, this emphasis on community, on the circle of life, right? These deep symbolic aspects to the kolo dance. In 1859, some researchers were paying closer attention to the South Slavs, to folk culture, and a quote. So again, after the work in the fields from the Zadruga, the people, the community, the farm members would come back together, and work is a feast. There is singing all day in the evenings, which one would expect people to be tired after a long summer day's work, But the merry young folk start a kolo dance. So rather than going home and going to bed, right, you come home from a hard day's work and you dance and you sing. And once again, you reaffirm and you support that sense of community within the Zadruga. Again, the Zadruga is a patrilineal system, but nonetheless, women in Croatian peasant culture, there is a special reverence for them, particularly mothers as well. There might be what we call, in fact, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense either, but on the anthropological side of things, a cult of motherhood, where mothers are commonly celebrated, once again, in Croatian folk art, in music, in storytelling. They symbolize themes of comfort, of protection, of land also. Think of the motherland. Think of fertility associated with agricultural communities, okay, as well as with Croatian identity, right? Ultimately, who are the carriers of culture in Croatian society? It was the mothers passing down traditions. Yes, the house mother, usually the wife of the patriarch. Once more, she has her own sphere of influence, particularly within the household. Coordinates work among the other women. And again, especially has a lot of authority over her own sons. Women were traditionally responsible for managing the home, as well as children. They also care for animals. They assist in the fields. They're also, once more, the primary caregivers and educators of children, right? So familial identity, inheritance, once more, that's tied to your father, but your language, your dialect, your customs, your religion, these are all taught to you by your mother in traditional Croatian culture. Again, critical in the transmission of language, religion, culture, custom. This is especially true and becomes ever more important after mass immigration. Why? Who's emigrating, particularly in the early years? It's the men, and often fathers, right? So absentee fathers coming to places like Pittsburgh to find work, to earn wages. The women are left behind. They not only have to maintain, of course, their traditional duties, but now they have to take on additional responsibilities. And in some cases, they become, with the exception of maybe uncles, maybe the senior patriarch, women become, in many cases, the real representative of Croatian life. Okay? And consider also, right, so there's this special reverence for mothers in Croatian culture. Once more, the Croatian people are predominantly Roman Catholic. Who's the mother of mothers in Roman Catholicism, right? There's also this intersection, let's say, of Roman Catholic belief and the lived experiences of the Croatian people. Not that I need to show this to you on the slide. You can look right up above the altar. Yes, this is Mary, Mother Mary, Queen of the Croats, painted by Vanka in 1937. But once again, consider, right, the sort of the intersection or the symbolic expression of motherhood and the ties to faith, to Catholic faith. The child as well, the Christ child. Christ is holding grapes and wheat, two primary crops, two very important crops to the Croatian people. Once more, I hope maybe you're getting a sense of how Catholicism, Catholic traditions, Catholic rites really become an expression of the lived experience of the Croatian peasantry. Does that make sense? Yeah. Some other paintings by Vanka. At left is so that our fields may be fertile. Again, stressing this emphasis or this association between mothers, between land, between faith. And in this image, you do see a woman kneeling in prayer before an icon of Mary, nonetheless. Right? Think of the motherland, praying to the mother of mothers, hoping that the motherland will produce food for the Zadruga. Does that make sense? Yeah, and at right. Obviously, that's right here, actually. Pastoral Croatia, another work by Vanka, 1937. Right. But modernization, I might ask you to think, right? So words like modern and modernity, modernization, they tend to have a positive connotation. They tend to mean new and fresh, right? Not that isn't true. But what does that mean for the Croatian people? What does that mean for the peasants at the turn of the century? What does modernization bring? What also does it end? What does it bring an end to? Modernization, in a more academic sense, refers to this broad transformation of traditional rural agrarian societies into more secular urban and industrial societies. And there's mass social, economic, and political change that's occurring, again, both in Europe and in the United States at the turn of the century. This means a breakdown for the traditional peasant way of life. Agriculture will be transformed into capitalist modes of production. the commercialization of goods. Once more, it's no longer good enough to produce food for simply to sustain the Zadruga. You now need food surplus to sell. You need to be able to sell it. This will translate to different regions of Croatia, turning into monocultures, growing specific crops, again, for sale, for market. Okay? Communal lands will be replaced by individual family farms. So again, rather than having a communal farm, once land is perceived as a commodity, as something to be bought and sold, it begins to be divided and subdivided to the point where, in many cases, those plots are too small to be productive, right? Too small to be productive. 80 to 90% of landowners will have 3 acres or less by 1910. 3 acres or less. It's not enough land to have a productive commercial farm. Okay? And this introduction of monetary tax burdens means that the peasants now need cash dollars. They need cash money to pay taxes, right? There's not enough money within Croatia or within the Croatian peasant society to pay many of those burdens. So what is the alternative? Many of them will begin to look elsewhere. They need to make money, right? That's ultimately the driver of Croatian immigration to the United States, into places like Pittsburgh, where there were mills and mines and factories, again, coming here to make money, either to send it home or to eventually return home with that money. A quote from a Croatian school teacher in 1910, "The Hungarians have our money and give us just enough to keep us alive." Again, in other words, the Croatian people are required to pay taxes to the Hungarian administrators in this Austro-Hungarian Empire. Much of that money being spent where? Do you think it's being reinvested in the Croatian lands or within the Croatian peasantry? Typically not, right? So Croatian peasantry forced to pay taxes, and then those tax dollars being invested elsewhere. So I hope that makes sense. This is to the right, and I know it's very blurry, but that was an image of a Zadruga village, and a nice little clipping I thought I'd read to you. This is quite a wealthy Zadruga with money in the bank, and the old man at its head is likewise the head official of the village. We are told, if I remember rightly, that 2 of the sons are in America and 1 in Pittsburgh, meaning Pittsburgh, of course. Yeah. The old man seemed to be seized with a sense of yearning, for he twice smoothed his worn hands down my cheeks and said, "Greet Janko for me if you see him in America." That was from 1906. Right. And emigration, right? 4 million people will leave that Austro-Hungarian Empire by about the 1870s in the First World War. It's about 10% of the population in a single generation. It's a massive movement of people. Croats, part of that, but also, Serbs, Slovaks, Slovenes, Czechs or Bohemians, Poles, Rusins, Romani, Magyars, Germans, Jews, other groups as well. Again, leaving that old empire, many of them coming to the United States. There are about 600,000 Croats who will leave the empire. More than 80% of them are destined, again, for America. Modernization, once more, this means a breakdown for Croatian or traditional Croatian peasant society. In Croatian history, sometimes this is also referred to as the White Plague. This is mass population decline. It's also the creation of a large Croatian diaspora around the world. Again, these demographic shifts in mass distribution of populations, they're driven by now industrialization, of urbanization, of restructured political boundaries. Again, things that we would categorize as modern or as part of these, the shift towards modernization at the turn of the century. I might note, right? So at left we have a photograph of a family. Do you notice anything weird about the man's legs, by the way? They're missing. The man has no legs. Why does he have no legs? He's been added to the image. He's been added to the image. So the photograph was taken actually back in Croatia. The women, the grandmother, the mother, and the baby. Where was the father? He's here. He's already here in Pittsburgh. You want a family portrait, right? But the father's gone. So he's plugged into the back of that photo. Yeah. The second industrial revolution, right? So again, kind of discussed these massive changes that are occurring in the old world, in Croatia, at the turn of the century. But what's happening here? What's happening here in the United States? We refer to it as the second industrial revolution, this period of rapid industrialization, of urbanization, of technological innovation, social transformation. The synergy of what, right? Of coal, of coke, of iron, of steel, transportation, communication, right? This is going to provide a foundation for growth, economic growth, the Bessemer process. Actually, this goes back. Carnegie did not by any means invent the Bessemer process, but this is a new technology that's going to be the foundation for Carnegie's steel empire, removing the impurities in the creation of steel. Also, international trade is going to be made more efficient by railways, by steamships. Colonies, what are colonies? Colonies are going to supply the raw materials for the manufacturing. Colonies, what I think often gets overlooked is that colonies are markets, right? It's not just places of extraction, but you need places to sell your stuff. Right? You need places to sell your things. But again, colonization, industrialization, the world seems to be getting smaller. It creates a global labor market. Millions will migrate to urban centers. Before the 1920s, by the way, most Americans still lived in rural areas. It's not until the 1920s that a majority of Americans settle in urban centers. Immigrants from the British Isles will be overshadowed by those from South and Central Europe for the first time in American history. Again, it's the turn of the century where immigrants who are predominantly Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish begin to overshadow Protestants from the British Isles. Does that make sense? Migrants, they're not simply moving from pre-modern to modern environments. I hope that makes sense. It's not as deterministic or as linear as the story is often told. Rather, migrants are a critical component, of modernization. That is the labor. That is what is needed for this industrialization and modernization to occur. Does that make sense? Yeah. Again, it's not this process of immigrants coming from backward places to already modern places. It's immigrants coming from predominantly rural places, that's true, but to centers that are modernizing. And again, they are a catalyst for that modernization. The U.S. will become the single largest destination for for international migrants. 18 million arrivals between 1890 and 1919. In 1910, believe it or not, Pittsburgh is the 8th largest city in the country. The 8th largest city in the country. New immigration, not so new anymore, but this is the term that we use again for that mass immigration at the turn of the century. More than 25 million immigrants to the U.S. between 1880 and 1924. 34% of the U.S. population are immigrants or the children of immigrants by 1900. Pennsylvania will become the second most populous state by 1900, and 15% here are foreign-born. Pittsburgh, including Allegheny City, which is Pittsburgh's north side, will grow from 45,000 in 1870 to 450,000 in 1900. A 900% increase in 30 years. Yeah. Ellis Island, by the way, doesn't open until 1892. You might think that a little bit late. And if your ancestors came from Central Europe, after 1892, 3/4 of them are processed through Ellis Island, but other ports are still being used. Before Ellis Island, there was Castle Garden in New York, but also Baltimore, Philadelphia. Some people will come through Boston, some will come through Canada. But anyway, after Ellis Island is opened in 1892, 98% of arrivals are admitted. 98%. Again, we refer to this period as historians as really a golden age for free movement around the world. Not only are people allowed to leave empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but those who show up on the shores of the United States are practically all admitted as well. There are about 480,000 Croatians who arrived in the U.S. between 1880 and 1914. By the way, the majority of Serbs as well. Serbians also are coming from Croatia. They're also coming from Croatia rather than Serbia proper, for the same reasons that other peoples from Austria-Hungary are leaving that old empire. And yeah, they're going to settle in cities like Pittsburgh, in Cleveland, in Chicago, but also in smaller industrial towns and coal patches on the industrial frontier of northern Michigan, of Wisconsin, of Minnesota, of Montana. What's the reaction, do you think? Are they welcome? Are they always welcome? No. This will spark widespread nativism, xenophobia, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, a surge of white Protestant nationalism. Again, Catholics especially are often perceived as incompatible with American democracy. There was, at this time, an association that democracy was somehow Protestant. Okay? But again, the Croatians and other peoples at the turn of the century, they're typical of labor migration, economic migration. They're economic migrants. Croatian men, particularly in the early years, will outnumber women, 6 to 1. 6 to 1. Most of prime working age, again, drawn to these emergent industries, these heavy industries, where there's a demand for labor, mining, steel making, meat packing as well. The Padrone system, it had an association with Italian immigrants, but certainly not exclusive to Italian immigrants. Certainly not exclusive to Italian immigrants. This was a contract labor system in which immigrants would be recruited by companies to work again in mines or mills. Companies intentionally target foreign workers, in some cases to manage labor shortages, in some cases to reduce wages, certainly, in some cases to break strikes as well. The Padrone, these were the labor agents. They tended to be immigrants themselves who had some kind of a connection to an employer as well as to the old country, and they facilitated immigration to the United States, often in unsavory ways. On one hand, the Padrone, they are this critical connection, again, in facilitating a labor force from the old world to the new, at the same time, highly criticized as a form of indentured servitude in some ways. So they might give you a loan for your passage to America under high interests. You may not return home really with any money at all. In 1885, the 1880s, this is when we really begin to see the beginnings or the origins of gatekeeping in the United States. The United States becomes more of a gatekeeping nation. Certainly, again, this mass immigration from South and Central Europe, a lot of suspicion about Catholics, about Orthodox Christians, about Jews. Many Americans felt that there needed to be more restrictions put into place, from Asia as well, I should mention. In 1885, we get the Alien Contract Labor Law. Prohibited these labor contracts, prohibits labor contracts. On one hand, yes, it's intended to protect the immigrants themselves from exploitation. At the same time, the goal is also partially to keep as many people possibly out as we can. The other side of that coin, Austria-Hungary will also begin to heavily regulate, these labor agents. It is true, many immigrants are being lied to about the opportunities in the United States. And when they come, they find themselves working in very dangerous conditions, many of them, in fact, dying or being injured. And so the Austro-Hungarian authorities, wanting to protect their subjects, on one hand, also wanting to reduce mass migration. Again, they lost 10% of their population in a single generation. Maybe trying to curb some of that population loss will begin to regulate the outflow of migrants. From wage earning in Pittsburgh in 1914, just a quote I thought I would share. For the wages they offer, they must take the Slav or run short-handed. The United States immigration agent in Pittsburgh is constantly besieged by employers of labor who need help. This may be hard for you to see. It's an image from Harper's Weekly of 1888, immigrants waiting to be distributed in the coal fields. We have the Padroni in the background, these tired immigrants in the foreground. Once more, waiting to be distributed to coal patches in southwestern Pennsylvania. So once that labor system in America is effectively banned, it won't end overnight. It won't disappear overnight. There are certainly agents who will continue, but over time, it will shift to a more informal process of immigration to the United States. Chain migration, the process by which immigrants establish pathways, for their relatives, for their friends, for people from the same country to follow, right? You have a cousin in Pittsburgh, you have a brother in Pittsburgh. They have a job that they know their company is hiring. They can set you up with a job. You'll have a place to live, right? Chain migration sort of replaces then the contract labor. And boarding houses, fascinating. One of the such an important institution, not only in Croatian American life, but in immigrant life more broadly. Many Croatian women will open their homes, extra bedrooms. If you had an extra room, you rented it out, for boarders, often family, often friends, neighbors from the old country. This is the urban adaptation of the Zadruga. Those Croatian traditions of domesticity, and spheres of influence will be reestablished here in Pittsburgh. Women will be able to contribute money to the household. They're also able to assist, their friends, their neighbors, their families from the old country once they arrive. And the missus, the boarding house missus, becomes this symbolic mother for Croatian immigrants in America. In Pittsburgh, 21% of Croatian widows will be somehow in the workforce, whether it be working in food processing or McGraw Wool down on River Avenue, but also operating boarding houses. Yeah, Croatian homes show the largest proportion of wives keeping boarders of lodgers of any other immigrant group in Pittsburgh. And Croatian families with lodgers, they numbered on average of 7 persons per household, 7 persons. And by the way, the boarders often took their turns in shifts. You might work a 10, 12-hour day, right? You're at the mill, you come home, you go to bed, the guy gets out of bed and goes to work. A rotating shift in the boarding house. And you tended, by the way, it wasn't necessarily a bed that you were getting. It was just a room. It was a space. It was a space for you to stay in. The U.S. Bureau of Mines, established in 1910 to address the hazards of coal mining. Many Croatians will work in the coal fields of Pennsylvania. They're among the lowest of all unskilled laborers in Pennsylvania. U.S. Bureau of Mines established, to address these hazards of coal mining, but they have no real enforcement powers. They provide no federal guidelines to regulate conditions. Pennsylvania is an industrial powerhouse at the turn of the century. Mines being a big component of that. 76% of Pennsylvania miners, are foreign-born by 1910. 76% of miners are foreign-born, most from Central and Southern Europe. 24,000 miners will die between 1900 and 1910. In 10 years, 24,000 coal miners will die. In 1902, again, if you've been here to St. Nicholas Church before, if you've been on one of our tours, there's a wonderful mural in the back corner. The artist was deeply moved by a story near Johnstown, Pennsylvania. The rolling mill mine disaster. And just to show you a headline from that and how it maybe relates to the mural itself. Wailing women seek their dead. Pennsylvania is also the leading producer of steel in the United States. Produced about 50% of the nation's steel by 1910. Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh as the steel city. In some ways, it would be more accurate to describe Pittsburgh as the steel district. It's not just Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh, but this patchwork or this network of mill towns along the riverbanks, right? For example, the Strip District, we have Carnegie's Union Mills, Crucible Steel. In Lawrenceville, Carnegie's Lucy Furnace. In Etna's, the Isabella Furnace. On the south side, Jones and Lawland. Braddock is the Edgar Thompson Works. Rankin, Carnegie's Carey Furnace. And Homestead was Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works. Again, plus many, many others, as well as associated industries. The famous Pittsburgh Steel District, this is a quote from the Pittsburgh Survey, 1910. The famous Pittsburgh Steel District has a population of 1 million, of whom 250,000 are wage earners. 70,000 in the mills, 20,000 in the mines, 50,000 on the railroads. These are all the great employment groups in Allegheny County. They're also the great accident groups. Some statistics from fatalities in the Pittsburgh district. In 1 year alone, 1906 to 1907, there were 195 people killed in steelmaking. At the Homestead plant, 53.2% of the employees were listed as Slavs. Of course, would have included Croatians, other groups as well. Labor conditions in iron and steel in 1913. Immigrants from Austria-Hungary, 56% of the workforce in iron and steel. At Wright, who is that, by the way? Do you know? Joe Magritz, yeah, right.
Magarach.
Magarat, say it again.
It's Magarach.
I'm not going to try. Yeah.
Magarach.
Correct, yeah. Sort of a folk story, pseudo-folk story. You get the sense that the man who recorded that story, Owen Francis, was maybe, the Croatian steelworkers in Braddock or Homestead were kind of playing with them a little bit. Anyway. So with all these hardships, right, in the United States, and again, just to kind of maybe stress the more holistic picture here of immigration to the United States at the turn of the century. The Croatian people, right, in some ways they're being uprooted. They're being uprooted from their homeland, forced to now find work elsewhere to take part in a monetary economy. Right? And they're coming to places like southwestern Pennsylvania to work in the mines and the factories and the mills. The intent for many of them is not to stay. It was never to stay for many of them. Again, the whole point is to make money. That is the new reality of life. We have to earn cash dollars and then maybe go home and buy a piece of land and have a farm for ourselves. That's the ultimate goal. Approximately 1 in 2, approximately 50% of all Croatian immigrants will return home. 50%. Across Austria-Hungary, there are 400,000 immigrants who returned to Austria-Hungary between 1900 and 1910. Again, migrants, they're not necessarily longing for these alien urban environments, right? The ebb and flow of migration tended to follow economic conditions in the United States. Economic downturns are frequent. There were, 18 recessions and panics between 1880 and 1929. 18 recessions or panics. 1907, Coincidentally, or ironically, it's the largest year on record at Ellis Island for the number of arrivals. It's also, however, the year of a panic, the Panic of 1907 in October. It's also the record year for return migrants, 1907. It's also, by the way, the worst year in U.S. mining history, 1907. More than 3,000 miners are killed in 1907 alone. A quote from A.E. Steiner in 1909. He was on ship, sort of witnessing these return migrants, and he writes, "There were Croatians, a few Dalmatians, many Bulgarians, and Serbs who for some reason are the least successful among our Slavic toilers. They were all in rags, looked pinched and half-starved, and told their hard luck story with many embellishments." Again, the ultimate goal is to come to the United States for money, to find a job, to maybe take that money home. Many of them do not return with much money at all, however. They love Croatia dearly. Each one longs for home and wants to die here. We Slavs are so soft-hearted. Homesickness is our disease. On account of it, many Croatians cannot hold out and return home too soon, from the Croatian school teacher in 1910. This is a chart showing return migration among different groups of the Croatians and the Slovenians. 26,000 of them arrive in 1908. About half of them return. What will end migration to the United States? Well, the First World War is a big factor there. Travel becomes dangerous. Steamship travel becomes dangerous. You're probably familiar with the story of the Lusitania, the passenger ship that is sunk by German U-boats, right? But again, yes, steamship travel becomes very dangerous. World War I brings an effective end to this period of new immigration. In the aftermath of World War I, you're probably familiar with the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties. That's true. 1920s are the Roaring Twenties. They're also, however, the Tribal 20s. We refer to social historians, we refer to the 20s as the Tribal 20s. Again, widespread nativism, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, white Protestant nationalism becomes very, very pronounced in the interwar period. This is a hostile reaction to economic change, foreign conflict, demographic shift, and in 1924, we get the Johnson-Reed Act, or also known as the National Origins Act. This essentially shuts the door on immigration to South and Central Europe. Again, there were those who felt perhaps that there were too many Catholics here already. President Coolidge signs this law, or signs this bill into law, and in doing so, he says, America must be kept American. Michigan Representative Grant Hudson in 1924, also sponsoring this bill, or in the debates around this bill, says, and I quote, "Now, what do we find in all our large cities? Entire sections containing a population incapable of understanding our institutions, with no comprehension of our national ideals, and for the most part incapable of speaking the English language." Consider the fear and characterization of urban centers as foreign places. Pittsburgh and Allegheny City, let's see here. Allegheny City is really like the core of Croatian settlement in the Pittsburgh region. What is now Route 28 used to be East Ohio Street. That was at one time, by 1920, really a homogeneous Croatian neighborhood or Croatian enclave, centered around there used to be another St. Nicholas Church there, actually. But Mala Jaska, that neighborhood was known as, again, this strip kind of along the river flats, what is now Route 28. The workers there by 1920, primarily in stockyards and animal processing, 27% of them. Hers Island, being the main employer, the multiple establishments there. 27% of them in, or excuse me, 21% of them also in steel, 11% of them in railroad, on the railroad. And the North Side did at one time have a thriving network of livestock, meat packing, animal food, and processing plants. This church, St. Nicholas Church, catered not necessarily to the Croatians on East Ohio Street, but to the large number of Croatians across the river in Lawrenceville and in Etna, and up on top of the hill in Reserve. So I hope that makes sense. The tale of two St. Nicholas churches. St. Nicholas Parish, this St. Nicholas Parish is the first Croatian parish established in the United States. The original church was dedicated on East Ohio Street in 1895, named in honor of the patron saint of Jastrebarsko. Again, the neighborhood being known as Little Jaska or Mala Jaska. A bishop in Croatia, Bishop Strossmayer, very important figure in Croatian history, particularly at the turn of the century. It is none other than Strossmayer who will send the first priest to St. Nicholas Church, Father Bozic, which translates to Christmas, by the way, Father Christmas at St. Nicholas Church. Just a nice coincidence. But disagreements are soon going to arise between the priests and the parishioners over how money should be spent. Again, a common accusation leveled against the Croatian immigrants was that they were incompatible with American democracy. But in fact, you begin to see democracy take root within the parish and among the immigrant communities. Again, the debate is, the parishioners say, we're the ones funding the church, we're the ones organizing all the church events, we should have a greater say in how church money is being spent. The priest says, no, that's not how it's done. Right. Over time, the original priest, Father Bozic, is asked to resign. He's asked to resign. Tensions escalate so much that he eventually does, and he goes and he takes on a new congregation near Steelton, Pennsylvania, But he's replaced with a new priest, Father Glonerich, who was maybe a little more punitive. And he sought to remove, in fact, the Croatian church outside of Mala Jaska, outside of the community. In other words, there are too many troublemakers here. Maybe if I move the parish a mile, 2 miles up the road to Millvale, things will be easier. He gets his way. In fact, both communities get their way. Father Glonerich is permitted to establish St. Nicholas Church here on the top of Bennett Hill. Of course, the community back in East Ohio Street, they're going to cry foul. That's our church. We still need a church. So they're going to construct a new church as well. So at that point, and by the way, this was the original St. Nicholas Church. It was from a converted house. The home was bought in 1894. Essentially, the community slapped the belfry on the one side of it, again, and that was the first Croatian church in America. But by 1900, both of these communities have kind of outgrown St. Nicholas Church, and they both want their own churches. And thus we have St. Nicholas in Millvale, completed and established in 1900. And then the other, if you're from Pittsburgh, if you travel Route 28, you might be familiar with the large church that used to be there, but that was raised, I want to say at this point, it's probably, has it been 15 years already? Yeah. But just to show you some more images. So again, Mala Jaska, from Little Jastrebarsko. Jastrebarsko was a region in Croatia where many of the early Croatian immigrants to Pittsburgh had come from, right? And this is a postcard showing the village, or the town, I should say, actually, of Jastrebarsko. And consider the similarities. Why many of those Croatian immigrants, it may have reminded them, this new environment may have reminded them of Jaska or of Jastrebarsko. This is near the foot of, again, what is now Route 28, going into the north side. There's the steeple of St. Nicholas Church, the other St. Nicholas Church that was down on Route 28. Here again, we have St. Nicholas Church in the distance, as well as what was then known as the Duquesne School next door. Many of the Croatian children who grew up on East Ohio Street in the early days do attend the Duquesne School. This photo is from 1921. This was the original building of the original St. Nicholas Church. It's fallen into dilapidation, of course. The windows are broken. You can also see there are two children playing in the yard, covered in soot, covered in dirt. The belfry is still present. So by this point, of course, this is not serving as a church. This has become the headquarters of the National Croatian Society, which is sort of the predecessor of the Croatian Fraternal Union. Did you know there used to be homes on both sides of the street down there, going into Northside along Route 28? Again, it was more of a communal environment, more of a village environment. Some of the children or grandchildren who grew up hearing stories from their parents and grandparents of what life used to be like do describe it as more of a communal environment. Some more children, presumably again young Croatian children, along East Ohio Street. The row houses, some of them not in great condition. And finally, one more to show you. I love it because, I don't know if you can see it, there's a little Croatian grandmother peeking her head out the window, spying what's going on out there in the street. Yeah, but you know what, let me stress this too. These three homes right here, in order, all operated, by the way, by Croatian widows. By widows. The mothers had all lost, or the wives had all lost their husbands in one way or another. This house here with the sort of the interesting shape was a boarding house. The building next door, or actually one door over, was sort of a speakeasy. There was a speakeasy in the basement. The grandmother produced wine and slivovitz. Again, the husband had died. How are you going to make money? Well, take in boarders, rent out the place next door for a speakeasy, and make some homemade alcohol. And on the corner was a little grocery store, the Bubash Grocery, which again the wife had taken over after the husband had perished or died. Excuse me, very young. I think he was he 35 when he died? Oh, excuse me. Anyway, I appreciate you guys, or everybody coming to hear me tell some of these stories.
We'll give a few minutes for some Q&A.
You had mentioned the diaspora from Croatia, 80% came to America. Where did the other Croatians find themselves, and were they more successful in getting the money to go back to their homeland to get, the farm that they wanted?
Yeah, so many of them go to Central and South America as well. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, again, but most of them are finding themselves still in industrial or industrializing settings. So mines, some in fishing, some in oyster catching, things like that, but they're still rather they're unskilled labor jobs. Most of them are not, still making money or enough money to buy a farm back home. Australia is also a big one, but given the distance as well, many of them once they move to Australia or settle in Australia, many of them do stay there. Yeah.
You talked about those 3 boarding houses, and I was wondering how the stories of those boarding houses were preserved.
So I've been researching that neighborhood for a number of years at this point. My system has been to look at old census records and to locate families that had grown up on East Ohio, or that once lived on East Ohio Street, to then try to find any surviving or living individuals, the children or grandchildren of people who lived on East Ohio Street, or maybe somebody who grew up on East Ohio Street, cross-check them in the white pages, write them a letter, say, hey, do you want to get coffee and have a conversation about your family history? Many people have been receptive of that. So all of those homes, by the way, so they weren't all boarding houses. The one was certainly a boarding house. That was the Brinjak family, and the granddaughter of the woman who ran the boarding house, I've been able to speak to. The next house over was the Mikulon family. The family lived, it was actually a duplex. The Mikulon family lived in half of the duplex. The other side was where the speakeasy was, that they had rented out to a Bob and Evelyn Fries. And it was, again, it wasn't necessarily an illegal establishment. I think they had a license, but there was no like sign on the door. It had no name. But many of the individuals who grew up in that neighborhood still remember the speakeasy. And then the next building over was also a duplex. Again, kind of a reiteration of the Zadruga. An extended family lived there. There was the grandmother, Barbara Bubash, who ran the grocery store. Again, her husband he died pretty young. But also in the house, I think there were 16 people who lived between the two sections. The grandmother had a brother who lived there with his wife, and they didn't have any children. Her daughter lived there with the married family, and then another son with his wife who never married. So it was a big extended family who lived in these two partitioned, let's say, segments of a duplex building. Yeah, but again, more oral history, but talking to people who grew up there. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, let's do a nice round of applause again and say thank you to Vanka.
I'm going to ask you if you have a closing thought.
I just, with that being said, by the way, if anybody would love to tell me stories about their grandparents or parents or great-grandparents immigrating to the United States, I would love to hear those stories. So please find me and tell me those stories.